Hi there. Congratulations on your purchase of SmartConnect. In this video, I'll be introducing you to some of the many features of SmartConnect to help you get started on your first project. Everything in SmartConnect starts with connections. If I come over here and just click on Create Connection, you can see some of the many connections that we have available to you. A connection is your way of telling SmartConnect how to log into a particular environment. Every connection can be used as both source and destination in as many integrations as you choose. As you can see, we have many connectors out of the box, including the entire Microsoft stack, as well as things like NetSuite, Salesforce. But if you notice, we've also got a few out here that have curlicues and ellipses. These are REST APIs. Now, as you look around your business, you've probably got a number of single-purpose apps out there available for use. About 90% of the single-purpose apps out there have some form of REST API, which means you should be able to integrate with those REST APIs as well. So regardless what your first project is or what brought you into SmartConnect in the first place, please look around and see where else you could use SmartConnect to automate various different processes. You'll see throughout this video just how easy that is. For information on how to set up each of these connectors, please refer to our knowledge base where we've got information on pretty much all of those. Once we've established all of our connections, we can start to think about our data sources. Now, when we're talking about data sources, we also have to talk about how we're triggering our SmartConnect processes. You can see here that we've got bulk sources, change triggers, and real-time triggers. I want to start at the bottom just to work my way up. A real-time trigger kicks off a SmartConnect process as soon as your data is changed. Now, we don't support real-time triggers on all of our connectors, but you can see we do support them on quite a few. So basically, if I had, for example, an account in CRM and I wanted to automatically update my Business Central every single time that the account got updated, as soon as that user clicked on Save, I would set up a real-time trigger inside of my CRM data source. Similar to real-time triggers, we've also got change triggers. Now, what a change trigger is going to do is watch a particular entity and keep track of the fact that those entities got changed, but not necessarily kick off the SmartConnect process right away. Now, what's going to happen in those cases is we'll usually set up those processes on some kind of schedule to run every, 5, 10, 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever the schedule needs to be. And then every time the map runs, it's going to process all the changes that have happened to that data since the last time the map ran. Now, you can see the list is similar to what we had for real-time triggers for where those are supported. However, NetSuite does not support change triggers at this point. For more information on setting up and registering a change trigger or a real-time trigger, please refer back to the SmartConnect documentation. Now, all other data sources that are not real-time or triggers are considered bulk. So this includes files, folders, and of course, queries against your data source directly. When we talk about file data sources, we actually support all the different file types. So we do support Excel, obviously, and XML, both very common standards. And under text file here, we actually cover all the different delimiters for files that are available. So think commas or tabs or pipes or whatever it is, however you've delimited your text file, you can use that text file. Now, instead of starting a new one, I'm just going to go into an existing one to show you how an Excel file would get set up. Now, the reason I'm choosing this one is it is part of an example I'm going to be showing you in just a moment for our Excel add-in. Now, in this case, you can see that I've simply given it a name. I've selected a specific Excel file, which I can preview if I choose to. And you can see here, I do have some data within that file. Okay, and I'm choosing which Excel sheet I'm doing within that. Now, this select file at runtime, this is going to impact how the file is selected when the map is actually executed. By turning on this checkbox, what's going to happen is if a user comes into SmartConnect and tries to execute the map, they will be prompted to select a particular Excel file before the map will be able to run. Now, when I turn this on, we're going to talk about scheduling later on. If I do turn on select file at runtime, I'm not going to be able to schedule this map, which means it has to be executed manually. To be honest, when I'm setting up an Excel file data source, it's usually so that I can use the Excel add-in, which we're going to be talking about in just a bit, which means I'm not going to be checking this box anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and close this for now. Now, you might have noticed under the bulk sources, not only do we have files, which is a particular file in a particular spot, but we've also got folders. Now with the folder data source, basically what we're doing is creating a folder somewhere where files are going to get dropped. We have a couple of different options. I'll go over those in just a moment. But then what will happen is SmartConnect will check those folders on a regular basis to find files that match a particular template. If it finds files that match that template, it's going to actually process those files automatically. Then it's going to move those files either to a success directory or a failure directory. Let's quickly walk through setting up a SharePoint data source. So I'm going to click on Create Bulk Folder, and I'm going to choose an Excel data source. So let's give this a name. And instead of selecting files at runtime, I'm going to choose from a SharePoint connection. Now you might notice here we can also do FTP connections if you have files stored out on an FTP server somewhere. We have OneDrive, and we even have Outlook. Now all of these work exactly the same way. So for my file type, I'm going to choose Excel. I'm going to select a template file, and for me it's this customers file right here. Okay, now before I can validate, I'm going to have to fill in the SharePoint details. Now, obviously, if I had chosen FTP or Outlook or OneDrive, it wouldn't say SharePoint details. It would say whatever I chose details. Now, the first thing I have to do is choose my SharePoint connection. Now, you can see I've got mine called Teams Connection. For the record, to set that up, you're going to be under Connections, choosing the Microsoft Graph connection. It does not count currently under your connection count. So whether you've got up to 2, up to 5, up to 8 or more connections available to you, the Microsoft Graph connection does not currently count as one of those. Next, I have to choose my source directory. So where are the files going to get dropped? So for me, it's under pre-sales, it's under presentations, and it's under intro video. Okay, so this is my source folder where the files are going to exist. So after SmartConnect finds a file that matches and it processes that file, what am I going to do? If it's a success, I'm going to move it to the success folder. So a success in this case means that all the records within the file got processed into their final destination. A fail directory, so mine is called errors. I'm going to select that. Now basically what happens is if any of the records within my file fails, the file will get moved into my error directory. Okay. The next thing we have to choose is what do we do if that file is empty? So I reach into my source folder, I find a file that matches my template, but it doesn't have any records. I personally recommend that you never leave the file there. What's going to happen if you do is if this is a regular occurrence where you've got empty files, every time SmartConnect reaches into that source folder, it's going to continue to find that empty file. And if you get a big pile of them, it's got a whole bunch of files it has to go through. You're going to eventually slow down your integration a little bit. I would recommend that you either move the file to failure or success depending on the nature of your integration. Here's what I mean. Let's say that I'm moving from Excel, I'm importing raw materials into my inventory system. It's entirely possible that the system that's generating the files is generating empty files on the regular because we're not creating new items every 15 minutes. Of course, I'm assuming that my integration is running every 15 minutes at this point. So in that case, it's entirely not only possible, but probable that we're going to have empty files very regularly. I would consider those a success. It's not a big deal if that file is empty because it's likely that it will be. But if I'm running a transactional import, so I'm, getting files from my bank every single day, and I'm running this integration, I expect that something went through my bank account yesterday. So in that case, I want to move the file to a failure if it's empty, because I want to notify somebody that, hey, that file was empty. So for me, I'm just going to move file to success. Now these two options, overwrite files or append date time. Now this means when I move the file from source to either success or failure, what do I want to do to that file? If I allow overwrite, then I can have a file with the same name that just overwrites an old file with the same name. For me personally, from an audit perspective, I prefer to append the date and time to the file. So when I do that, I'm going to move the file regardless of its name from the source into either success or error, and then append the date and time, which means the file name will always be unique, which means I don't care about overwriting the files. What that means is when I come back to my success folder, when I come back to my error folder, I can tell very quickly when did that file get tried. So at this point, I can validate and I can preview, and the preview is just going to show me my source columns. The next thing we want to talk about is queries. Now, queries are all the other data sources. So they're not files. We're not setting it up as real time. We're not setting it up as a change trigger. So I'm going to click on Create Bulk Query up here. And if you notice, all those different connections that we had available earlier are all available to be data sources here. Now, what the data source looks like will depend on what the data source is. For example, in the case of a SQL query data source, we're going to have, it's going to connect us to a database, and we'll have a visual query builder or the ability to type in SQL if that's our bailiwick. In the case of Salesforce, it's going to be, again, a visual query builder or pass-through SQL. And if you notice these curlicues and ellipses up here, these are REST APIs, and what I'm going to get there is a drop-down list that contains all of the GET endpoints. So each of those connectors will work a little bit differently when you use them as a data source. We do have a ton of documentation out there at e1solutions.com in our knowledge base. So if you need help with any one particular data source setting it up, please check there first. So now that we've gone through all of our data sources, I want to talk about processes. So I'm going to select integration processes here. Now, processes are the meat of what SmartConnect is about. This is where we're going to be mapping our source to our destination. So I'm going to choose this process here, just to walk us through one that's already built. All right. In the details tab that we have right here, it's pretty simple. Just put an integration ID and description. Both need to be unique compared to all the other maps that you have available. Now down here, you can put your developer notes. So as you make changes to this map over time, please feel free to enter notes in here, click on add, and you'll see those notes show up here in this grid. Next, I'm going to choose my data source. Now, again, all those things we talked about for sources are available here to be chosen. In this case, I'm using an Excel data source. And you can see that Excel data source is a Stripe charges. This is the one that I showed you earlier today. You'll notice down here this group by and add source grouping. Now, what we're doing with the source grouping is identifying for SmartConnect, what is it about my data that creates a unique document? Now, here's what I mean by that. In our case, each record within our file is going to be unique based on the customer ID. Let's say we're importing master data like customers or vendors or items. Each row within our file actually represents a single document because I probably only got one row for customer Aaron Fitz. Even so, I'm going to choose whatever the unique identifier is for Aaron Fitz to say this row is a unique record, okay, a unique document. Now, let's assume that our data source is a transactional one. So within my data source, I might have 10 lines that represent a single invoice, for example. And then the next 5 lines represent a second invoice, and the next 7 lines represent a third invoice. So each of those invoices is a document in SmartConnect terms. So what I'm going to do with my source grouping is figure out how do I associate those first 10 lines, the next 5 and the next 7, to each other. There's usually a document number, maybe a document type. Maybe we don't have either of those things, and we have to group it based on customer number and item number, or something along those lines. So source grouping will identify what is a unique document. Now that term is going to come up again and again as we go through our integration process. Now this is a very important grouping. A lot of times when customers come back to me and tell me that they're struggling with a particular integration, very often it's because they haven't quite grouped everything correctly. Next, I'm going to click on Target. Now again, all of our different connectors. So just like when we were in data sources and we talked about all the connectors could be a source, all of our connectors can also be a destination, including files. I can export to XML or Excel or text or whatever you need me to export to. All right, in my case, we're writing to Stripe for this particular file. Now what we're doing next is choosing which particular Stripe connection. Now we've only got one to choose from in this case, but in your case, you might have multiple instances of the same REST API. And then what we're choosing here is what endpoints. In this case, is going to be showing all of my put, post, patch, and delete endpoints for my REST API. What's going to happen when we choose our actions to process is down below, we're going to see those actions added, and we're going to be able to eventually go to our integration tab and actually set it up. So let's do that now. When I come into my integration tab, the first sub-tab that I'm going to have here is source grouping. Now source grouping is for this particular target line, how do I find a single record within my document? So again, my example here is pretty simplistic. Each, it's matching what my source grouping was, okay? Because every group of customer ID is a unique record for what I'm writing to. But if you think about that transaction example I gave you, let's just choose that first document. When I'm writing into most ERPs that are accepting invoices, I have the concept of a header, which is things like customer number, document date, maybe there's a subtotal, stuff like that. And I've got the lines. Usually those are separate web services or separate endpoints that I'm writing to. And when I drop down this list, I'll see for example, invoice and invoice lines are both listed separately. Now, when I choose the invoice, for example, my source grouping, I don't want to pass through all 10 lines of my document into the header. So what I'm going to do there is probably group on document number or something like that, so that I only pass one time into the header service, even though it's 10 lines within my data source. Then when I get to my lines endpoint, I'm going to group by both document number and hopefully line number or some other unique identifier that gets me down to the individual line level. Maybe that's item number or something like that. Now, when I do group, you might notice these functions. I have the ability to aggregate some of my data. So one example I talked about was if my header had a subtotal. I don't generally have a subtotal field in my source data. So what I could do is do the sum of the extended amount on the lines, which would get me basically a subtotal by document. So this source grouping combined with the source grouping, they both work together to make sure you're getting the correct unique records for what you're trying to write into your target. Under target integration, this is where basically the rubber hits the road. This is the most important part of what we're doing here. So I'm going to have all of my target columns listed here on the left. I'm going to have all of my source columns here available on the right for me to choose. Okay. Now you'll notice that these are all red. So these are all marked as required fields within my data destination. Any of the different connectors that we work with regularly that are able to tell us what fields are physically required will be marked in red. What that means is, at a minimum, you have to populate those columns that are in red. Everything else will get populated based on the business logic of whatever system it is that we're writing into. Now, it's pretty rare that our data source and our data destination will exactly match. So for that, we've got these additional columns. Now, additional columns are no-code solutions to the regular integration problems that you're going to face, for the most part. I'll come back to why I say for the most part. If I click on Add Additional Column here, you'll see that I've got lots of different choices for the type of additional column. Now, I will tell you that this list will change a little bit depending on what exactly your target is. For example, in this example, I'm using a REST target, which means I'm using all of the additional columns that are available to a REST target. If I was writing to CRM or Salesforce, I would have a slightly different list where instead of a REST lookup, I'm going to have access to entity lookups and pick list lookups and stuff like that. So since they're different for every connector, and we've only got 45 minutes or so to get through this video, I'm not going to go into every single type of additional column that's available to you. I want to describe a couple of the more common ones, but please know that, again, all of the different additional column types are fully documented in the documentation for SmartConnect. So a couple that are more common, the date calculation is one of my favorites. As you work with different systems, there's a lot of different date formats out there. A date calculation will give you 3 dropdowns. The first dropdown is what field am I looking at? The second dropdown is what is the date format in my data source? And the third dropdown is what do I need it to look like? So what format do I need for my destination? For those of you watching this video who write a lot of code, you know that you could move those date parts around through code. That's entirely possible. However, the whole point of SmartConnect is to make this as easy as possible so that you can write the code that's necessary, not just repetitive code like moving date parts around. We have local constants, which is passing in a hard-coded value. Translations is one that's also very important for a lot of integrations. What this allows you to do is when my source contains one value, but my target requires another value that's based on a list, I can set that up as a mapping table or a translation table. So one example of that is when I'm integrating a CRM solution to an ERP solution, quite often the lines within an order on the CRM are referred to as product lines. However, I need that to be referred to as an item line when I import that to my ERP. I can use a translation that just says when I see product, I want to return item. Very similar for those who write code to a select case statement, something like that. But in this case, it's a very simple mapping exercise. Now, for those times where we haven't covered what issue you're having, we do have the ability to have a calculation field. A calculation is JavaScript in the case of smartconnect.com, and it allows you to do all the things you might need to do. In this case, you can see I'm doing a formal calculation, amount times 100, and you do have access to all of your source columns and all of your global variables. If you notice up here, we do have a couple of checkboxes as well. Some of our connectors allow you to flag this update existing. For a number of our connectors, SmartConnect will check first to see if that record exists. So think most of the ERPs we deal with, think all of the CRMs that we deal with, even SQL Server. We'll take a look for each document based on the original source grouping as to whether or not that record exists in the target system. Then we'll take a look at your update existing checkbox. Now, if update existing is turned on and that record exists, we'll update it. If update existing is turned off and that record exists, we'll throw an error message that says this is a duplicate record. Regardless of whether that box is turned on or off, we will always create records that didn't exist. The next tab to talk about is the Options tab right here. So a couple of things here that you need to think about. If no data is returned from the data source, again, same discussion as what we had with the folder data source when we talked about empty files. Whether you return a success or failure in the case of empty data sources is going to depend on the nature of the integration. So now think about I'm integrating from my CAD solution to my inventory management solution. We're not creating new items every 15 minutes, even though this integration runs every 15 minutes. So what we're going to do is return map success. Again, it's highly likely that we'll get an empty data source. However, if this is from our very, very busy online store, and we're running this integration, every 15 minutes, and I don't get some data, I probably want to return a failure just to let someone know that they should take a look. Okay. In the case of empty lines within my data source, usually this would only apply to something like Excel where I've had users modifying the data. This usually wouldn't apply to an actual data source where we're pulling data from an actual database of some sort. However, what I would do if there's some concern that there might be blank keys, I might choose to exclude the data with blank keys, or if I do nothing, I'll at least alert somebody that they left that key field blank and that there was an error message. Okay, in a little bit we're going to talk about error processing. So if that's going to be the case, I am going to choose to save processing errors. Okay, and I'm not going to export those usually. So saving processing errors is going to allow me to go to this error processing window that we're going to talk about in a little bit. All right, the next tab to talk about is tasks. Now what tasks allow us to do is turn our integration into an application. Again, each of our task types are fully documented. The goal of this video is to introduce you to the concepts associated with them. So I'm going to talk about stages first. So a task can be executed before your integration ever runs, while your integration is running, either before each document or after each document succeeds or fails, or after the integration as a whole succeeds or fails. Now, while we're here talking about timing, I am going to be choosing failure because this is going to tie into our error management discussion later on. But I do like to define document failure versus integration failure. Now, let's assume that I have 10 documents that are being processed. 2 of those documents fail. So what's going to happen is I'm going to have 1 integration pre-task execution time. I'm going to have 10 document pre-tasks. I'm going to have 8 post-success tasks. I'm going to have 2 post-document failure tasks that get executed. And I'm going to have 1 post-failure task. So if any one of my documents fails, my entire integration is considered to have failed. Now, that does not mean that we rolled back the 8 transactions that succeeded. Those 8 transactions have still succeeded. It's just that the integration as a whole is considered a failure. The reason I bring up document post-failure versus integration post-failure in here in particular is if I have a task that has to be executed regardless of whether the integration succeeded or failed, I need to make sure I set it up under both integration post-success and integration post-failure. For example, let's assume that I have a second map that has to be executed against those 8 documents that succeeded in my example. I have to put the execute map task under both integration success and integration failure because integration failure is the only set of tasks that runs if any one document within my integration failed. All right, so I'm going to choose integration post-failure again because it ties into our future discussion. And then I have the ability to choose what types of tasks I can run. So running an integration is one that I just alluded to. I'm going to choose that right now just to kind of walk you through some of the choices here and just to show you the real power of it. All right, so with run integration, I'm going to give you an example. I did a project one time where my customer was selling water heaters. And when they install the water heater at their customer's house, they don't sell the water heater to the customer. They actually rent the water heater to the customer. So for every installation record that we had to deplete inventory, we had to create a fixed asset, and we had to create a field service equipment record. Now, those were three different processes that needed to be executed every time a water heater got installed. So we used the run integration tasks. Now we did it at document success. Okay, and we chose the integration we wanted to run. So I'm just going to choose this one at random. The important part of this is these things down here. Now, when it talks about using data from the parent, let's take my example of the water heater installation. I had one installation record that was being passed in as a data source. Now, I was using that same data source set up on each of my three maps. However, when it was time to execute the second map, I didn't want to re-query the data source. I wanted to process the exact same document that the inventory depletion used. So what I did was I turned on use data from parent. That means the exact same records that went through the first map will be passed into the second map. You're not going to re-query that data source because, let's be honest, that data source could have changed in the time it took to execute that first map. The other thing to talk about is parent variables here. Variables are a little bit beyond the scope of this particular introductory video. However, what the use parent variables allows me to do is establish a variable value within my first map and pass that value to my second. So in my example, I set a variable to equal the cost of the inventory that just got depleted, and then I passed that to my second map, which now I could use that as the beginning book value for the fixed asset I was creating. All right, now I told you that I wanted to talk about some of these other types. So we do have other things. Run script and run SQL command are used less in cloud integrations these days. They were used a lot more when we were doing on-premise integrations. However, they still get used. A run SQL command, for example, I might have a staging database set up on SQL Server, and maybe I need to update a particular status within that staging table. Maybe after I imported to SQL Server, I need to execute a store procedure or do some updates. All of those are possible. Running a script will give me, again, JavaScript as a window, and I might be doing things like setting global variables or, something like that. Maybe I'm establishing a batch ID at the start of the integration, whatever it is I have to do within script. The real meat from an error processing standpoint comes with these four right here. So I can send an email message to my users. I can send a message on Teams or Slack or Trello. I'm going to choose Teams because I like Teams. Also, I haven't set up Slack or Trello in this environment. If you have those, you fill your boots. And again, I'm choosing post failure here because I want to send a message to my end users that there was a problem. In every integration that you automate, whether it's on a schedule or whether it's in real time, you should make sure that you have notifications set up appropriately. You don't want to set up an integration where users have to log in and look at a log file for some reason. You certainly don't want to wait till month end or wait until your angry customer phones to find out that an integration didn't run. Now, because this is a message to Teams, we have our graph connection again. I'm going to choose that same connection I chose earlier. Now I have a choice in Teams whether it's going to a channel or a chat. I'm going to choose a channel here. I'm going to choose my pre-sales team and then my general channel within that. Okay, so what will happen in this case is every time there's an integration error, so at least one document in my integration fails, I'm going to send a message on this particular channel. Okay, now the message contents are down here below, and I'm going to use variables to define those contents. So usually what I'm going to have is, for example, maybe the start of the message is this is why we don't type on camera. and I might choose my map ID here. Okay, I might have a run date, for example, where I'll come in here and choose my global run date. I might set the number of records. I might have one for the number of errors. Just as much information as I can give them. Now, the most important one that you're going to include is something along these lines, where I'm going to put in here my run errors variable. So now let's go back to my example. We've got 10 records that we were processing. 2 of those documents failed. This is going to put 2 error messages that we got back from the target into the body of this message. So I could click on save, and this will run every time. Now I'm not going to save on this one because this is just a sample. So note that if that had been an email, we would have had a from and a to field instead of choosing a channel. But again, the most important thing that we have for all of our integrations is to set up notifications for errors, especially for integrations that are not being executed manually. Now, just so you know, those communication tasks don't have to be used in terms of error processing only. Here at E1, we've actually got a process where when you place the order for SmartConnect in the first place, the account manager responsible for your account received a positive email saying that you had purchased SmartConnect, so they could work with you to make sure that you got the best possible integration experience that you can, starting with sending you this video. I've mentioned scheduling several times. Process scheduling happens down here on the left-hand side. I'm going to click on New Schedule. With scheduling, you're going to choose what integration it is you want to schedule. You're going to choose whether you want that schedule to run every single day, certain days of the week, certain days of the month, or just one single time. So I'm going to choose certain days of the week here just to kind of show it to you. Now the schedule, if we click on save, the schedule will stay enabled or stay active until I either uncheck this box or delete the schedule. Okay. Now I'm going to choose the start time for my certain days of the week. Okay, I'm going to execute it. I can run it every n weeks. So if I want it every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, whatever my integration needs to run, I'm going to choose every single week. And I'm going to choose only my business days. Okay, so starting at 8 a.m. on every weekday, every single week, we're going to run this map. Now, if I leave this as is, it will execute at 8 a.m. on each of these days. If I want that to happen throughout the day, I can repeat it. Now, the smallest increment I can put in this is 5 minutes. So I can only run a process every 5 minutes. Now, you need to figure out how long your process takes. You can't schedule it in increments smaller than it takes to run. Right? So if you design a process which takes 8 minutes to run, you don't want to schedule it every 5. To be honest, in my experience, 15 minutes is close enough to real time for most users. So that's generally where I'll schedule. Next, I'm going to choose what time I want it to end. So in this case, what's going to happen is for every weekday, starting at 8 a.m., we're going to run this process every 15 minutes until 8 p.m. and then we're going to stop. Again, I'm not going to save this. This was really just to get you thinking about how the scheduling works. The other thing I mentioned earlier was process errors. So I told you that you could check a box under options to save those process errors. If this is an integration that's automated, I might choose to do that to save my process errors, because what that allows me to do is to come into my error processing window. I can choose a particular map. I can see which runs have failed. I can expand that. I can even drill in, so I can see there were 13 errors in this particular run. If I click on this pencil, I have the ability to see what all of those errors are. So I can click these red dots to see what the error message is. Okay, and I can even fix the data. If there was no problem, I could just leave the data as it is and rerun the selected tenant, which would reprocess it as it is. However, if there was a data problem, I could change these values, and then I could click on run selected tenant, and that's going to re-execute this. Now, when you're out there in the wild doing this for real, most of your issues are going to be data related. So basically what that means is your source is sending data that doesn't exist in your destination. Now there's two different scenarios when that happens. The first is it sent data that should exist but doesn't exist yet, which means we need to fix our destination and re-trigger the map. Or it sent data that was incorrect that should not exist in the destination, which means I need to fix my source and reprocess the record. In both cases, I want to change either the source or the destination and have the map re-execute. I'm probably not going to come in here. This is really just a quick fix. To do this, we're not changing the source data itself. When we change data in here, we're simply changing this instance of that source data and running it to quick fix it. All right, now the last thing I want to talk about here is our Excel add-in. If you remember, I showed you a particular data source earlier that was an Excel data source called Stripe. Then the SmartConnect process that we walked through was going from Excel to Stripe, which was a REST API. Now what all of that was this particular file, this Stripe change Excel file. The reason I walked you through all that is to talk about the SmartConnect add-in for Excel. So if you notice at the top of my Excel, I've got this E1 Solutions tab. Now the add-in is available for download from e1solutions.com. Just go to Product Downloads, go to SmartConnect, and you'll see the Excel add-in. It is important that you download the right version for the version of Excel that you're currently on. But what the add-in does is gives us this service settings thing. So within our workbook, we've got a one-time setup where we're going to enter in our login credentials for SmartConnect. We're going to choose the SmartConnect process that's to be executed. That's the one that I showed you earlier. Okay. Here we're going to choose whether we want to open a process errors window or highlight the lines that are wrong. Now, again, this is going to depend on what type of data we're processing. If this is master data like customers or vendors or items or something like that we're uploading, where it doesn't matter if we keep sending the same data over and over again, I'll generally choose highlight line, which means my original file will be here. My 20 customers I tried to process will be still listed here, and I'll have a highlight over the ones that were incorrect. It will pop up a window to tell me what was incorrect about each of those records. But I'll have the opportunity to fix it and try again. Process errors would be more for transactions. So let's go back to I'm importing 10 transactions, 2 of them failed. I don't want my user to have to delete the 8 transactions that were correct just to process the ones that are highlighted. Instead, what I'm going to do is pop open a process errors window, which operates very much like the process errors window that I just showed you inside of smartconnect.com. It'll show them the documents that failed. It'll show them why those documents failed, allow them to change the data and try that data over again. Once this setup is complete, my users now have the ability to just modify this data. So I can change these records to have different amounts, and I can click on Run Map. Now what's going to happen is it's going to take the data directly from this workbook, process it through SmartConnect to our destination, and it'll tell us, you can see here I got a success, it'll tell us whether the document succeeded or failed, giving us immediate feedback. So some of the common use cases for the Excel add-in are things like month-end journal entries, where my accountants are calculating those in Excel anyway, so we might as well give them the ability to push those month-end entries directly into the ERP. Also true at year-end. Hopefully every once in a while your payroll department is calculating a bonus for you. They're probably doing that in Excel. So again, let's give them the ability to push that data to the payroll system directly, make their life a little easier, make sure they don't make any mistakes when they're typing my bonus into the payroll solution. Maybe I've collected a list of contacts at a conference somewhere and I want to push those to my CRM. There's a lot of different use cases for the Excel add-in. So I do encourage you to look around your business, find places where users are calculating things in Excel, or even cases where I don't want to consume a license. One way I've seen this used really effectively is Excel often gets used for procurement within companies. So I want to requisition a laptop. I have to generally, talk to somebody about getting that requisitioned. A lot of ERPs allow you to manage that requisition inside the ERP, but I don't necessarily want to have every single user within my company having access to that ERP. Well, enter the Excel add-in. I create all of the fields within my Excel file that I would need for creating that requisition. My user populates it. They click on Run Map. It pushes my requisition into the ERP so that it can now be processed through whatever approval process there is. So again, lots of different uses for the Excel add-in. I do encourage you to look around your business, see where it might be possible to fit in the Excel add-in. This really wraps up this video at this point. We've gone through all of the big rocks with SmartConnect and hopefully given you a good point to start from. For detailed information on anything that we covered, please feel free to go to smartconnect.com and check the knowledge base there, which is where we have a lot of documentation. And if you're still struggling, please feel free to reach out to support@e1solutions.com, and somebody here should be able to help you out. Thank you and happy integrating.